Okay, thanks. Thank you, Mattia. I will start with a comment on Tena's analysis of the conspiracy theories and the acceptance thereof by the people in the Balkans. Look, I mean, there has been much progress in the Balkans lately because we didn't see any official spreading conspiracy theories, unlike in the US, for instance, where the president of the largest, world democracy was the main actor spreading these theories. And in the Balkans, we didn't see, or at least I haven't seen any, politicians, presidents, prime ministers, spreading conspiracy theories. So on a more positive note, I think that we have demonstrated, the Balkans has demonstrated a lot of resilience to these, theories, alternative narratives, and so on and so forth. I will start my intervention with what Kurt Basiner, our friend, recently said. He said that it took him a decade in Bosnia and several years retreat at St. Andrews to understand how actually US politics works. So by studying the politics and society of the Balkans, but by being immersed in the Balkans in details, he became, able to more clearly grasp the politics of his country, the US, which is, by the way, the traditional pioneer of the liberal hegemony worldwide. So this rather honest and provocative confession is very much instructive of two important things that I want to focus on. First, the dominant ideas about the Balkans in the West are still very much loaded with hubris of the West's own imagined political, democratic, and value superiority. So the old ideas about the backwardness of the Balkans, and Maria Todorova has, very well described this, are intertwined with ideas about the superiority of the West. So the West is stable, the Balkans are unstable. The West is liberal, the Balkans are illiberal. The West is resilient to influence, the Balkans are not resilient to influence. The West is progressive, the Balkans are regressive. We have internalized these discourses, these narratives with the locals in the Western Balkans. This is not good. But this underlying and often very latent, they're not very often, publicly stated ideas, shape policy thinking in many different directions. The belated response of the West in the war in Bosnia 3 decades ago was one of the important directions this sort of thinking can take. I will say several words about other directions of this thinking later on. The second and the more important conclusion from Kurt's observation is that, deeply held ideas can only be challenged during a crisis. And the liberal world order, let's not forget, has been facing a crisis for some time now. And this is very much epitomized by the fact that, first, Trump spent 4 years in the White House, and more importantly, over 74 million Americans voted Trump this year. Half of American, voters, half of the American society. In other words, one only takes critical stance, towards one's own ideas if the world in which these ideas were created is fundamentally shaken, and the liberal hegemony of the US is fundamentally shaken. The liberal hegemony of the West is fundamentally shaken. The crisis is not coming from, the periphery. The crisis is coming from the center, to use this metaphor about, periphery and center. Back to the Balkans, these ideas of backwardness still shape policy thinking in the business of foreign policy and even in the business of development support, NGOs and so on and so forth. And they have actually produced the excessive focus on stability, which everybody would agree, still shapes Western policy towards the Balkans. The logic of this reasoning goes as follows. The citizens of these countries and their elites have not really adopted liberal values, so they're backward. So the most we can do with the West is to keep them quiescent and prevent them from hurting each other and producing international instability. This idea has been very successfully manipulated by the local political leaders in the Balkans, from both left, the center left, and the center right of the political centrum. Everybody manipulates this idea. The political vocabulary of our politicians still abounds, in 2020, still abounds with phrases they use to describe their countries and their regimes, such as, exports of stability, factor of stability, transforming a country from an importer to an exporter of stability. The problem they face is the fact that the priorities of our citizens, of the citizens of the Western Balkans, of all countries in the Western Balkans, have changed. Citizens have become more spoiled in the last decade or so. In war times and in times of turmoil, state building values or survival values, predominate the political frame. This is no longer the case. We are not concerned with survival. We are not concerned with, the fear of new war erupting. The peoples of the Balkans, I argue, live in fundamentally flawed, captured democracies, but still, we live in liberal democracies. Liberal democracies with very big problems, but still we live in liberal democracies. We don't live in authoritarian regimes. People therefore, feel increasingly confident to challenge the parameters of the systems they live in and the behavior of the elites. And we have seen this everywhere. We have seen this in Bosnia, 4 or 5 years ago when the protest cycle happened. We have seen this in Macedonia with the colorful revolution and the whole protest cycle from 2014 to 2016. The colorful revolution, let me give you an example, gathered tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of individuals who march under the banner of justice, rule of law, equality, all of them liberal demands, liberal values. The demands of the growing and increasingly assertive social movement in the Balkans are identical with the demands of, the current social movement in Western Europe, in the US. So it's liberal values, it's justice, equality, democracy, you name it. However, in the Balkans, the kleptocratic elites who captured the states, creating rules of the political game that benefit only them and not citizens, don't seem to be incentivized to adapt to this new reality of people asking things other than peace, stability, and so on and so forth. Despite growing popular grievances and nascent social movements, there is a consensus that the behavior of these elites has not changed. They are the same. The guys who were complicit in the wars are still in power. Somebody said this. There were several moments of hope in the last decades, that this behavior can be changed. I already mentioned the colorful revolution and the related mobilization in Macedonia, which gathered people across ethnic lines, people who hated each other in the past, who were taught to hate each other by their respective elites. It articulated the colorful revolution, liberal demands for justice, rule of law, problematizing corruption, problematizing authoritarianism, expressing and articulating demands for more democracy and more justice. Indeed, this process benefited from the activism of the political parties, but fundamentally they were bottom-up. They were bottom-up, and this is the most important thing about them. Coupled with increased interest and engagement of the liberal international community, which was not very much interested, in how Gruevski controlled our country, or in how Gruevski ran politics and ran the country, so colorful revolution, increased, engagement of the liberal international community resulted in regime change. And it's a good formula, it's a good recipe for other countries as well. What happened after this revolution? The new elite, the social democrats, the poster children of the West, who were made poster children by the Western political elites thanks to the Prespa agreement, thanks to their constructive behavior, They were very quick in realizing that benefiting from the system as it is, the capture state, is much more lucrative for them than trying to change it. If you try to change the system, you end up like, Djindjic in Serbia. So the structure of incentives for elite change, was simply not in place. It was not in place. Change, therefore, obviously, takes much more than giving a mandate to politicians, who prefer to play by the rules. And politicians, by definition, prefer to play by the rules. So how does the current structure of incentives look like? I will give you 3 examples, and I will be very critical for the sake of the provoking debate. In a report prepared recently by DPC and Eurothink that will be published very soon, it's a monster, 300 pages, exploring the links between endemic corruption and radicalization, or even political extremism and violence. We argue that the liberal international community, so not the illiberals, but the good guys, the guys who were deemed were considered good traditionally, was complicit in pacifying or even domesticating the protest movement in North Macedonia, dashing hopes from bottom-up induced change. This behavior was based on practical considerations. Governments are the preferred partners of governments. Governments work with governments. That's number 1. Number 2, governments represent commercial interests which sometimes coalesce with interests of domestic opposition to change. I'm still talking about liberal governments, and let me give you an illustration about this. In 2018, so 2 years ago, a rather minimalistic concept of progressive taxation was introduced in the Macedonian taxation policy. So progressive taxation. Traditionally, taxation policy in Macedonia and other countries like Macedonia was very much in line with conservative neoliberal dogmas, such as, this story about flat, tax rates being good for investors, for attracting money from abroad, and so on and so forth. And this change was championed by progressive policymakers from within the government, the Minister of Finance and his advisors, who were all part of the colorful revolution, by the way. So people who understand both policy and politics and social movements. This change was met with a lot of resistance from the domestic crime, business, media nexus scene. So the tycoons resisted this policy change, but it was not before the chamber of German businesses in Macedonia criticizing, this, that a U-turn, was made by the government. So this policy was put on hold when the German companies working in Macedonia said, no, this is not good. And finally, another, reason why I think that the liberal community is very often, complicit in not, in opposing change, goes beyond these practical, considerations. It's very often based on this fear of instability. So any type of radicalism, any type of social movements induced change is met with suspicion. So they rather work with, the elites, no matter how they are corrupt, than working or at least, than supporting social movements, or than supporting, people getting radicalized even in a positive way. So we have a problem. That's my okay, and I will finish here. I have several other points that I want to make, but I can make them afterwards during the discussion. Thank you.